immediately let you understand, and you will not get much more attention to this in the sermon. Here's the first thing that you need to understand when you're reading the whole Bible, but we definitely see this on repeat in the Old Testament. Are God's people sinless people? By no means. The example that we're going to see over and over in the Old Testament is not that salvation and God's redemptive plan for the world is accomplished through the holiness of his people. They are going to be moral failure after moral failure after moral failure. And not only will they be failures morally, we will see them to be spiritual failure after spiritual failure after spiritual failure. Well, here, these are connected. And this will help us, and these are the 2 points. So if you're wondering what should you be talking about if someone asks you at lunch, what were the 2 points to the sermon? Here are the 2 points to the sermon. The first, man's carnal ways do not fulfill God's promises. Man's carnal ways do not bring about the fulfillment to God's promises. And the second, it is God's compassionate faithfulness that will bring about the fulfillment of his promises. But we have joined together here both the spiritual failure, we'll call that faithlessness or unbelief, and the moral failure. There are many. Most dramatically is this use of a servant, another woman, to be the instrument by which Sarah could have children that would be credited to her and would be the heir of Abraham, thus fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant that absolutely hinges upon a son. Now, we live in a day and age which this connection between moral failure and spiritual failure also are very acute. You may be aware that in vitro fertilization is growing in popularity. Some of you may have been alerted to the fact that there are people in other countries who are having children here in our country of citizens, or even just, we'll say, born or conceived in our country through in vitro fertilization, by which there is a human female's egg that is fertilized through a human being who is male by his sperm, and then it is implanted to another human being that is a female. You have to talk this way in today's age, a female woman, and there gives birth, and then there is life. But you may not know what is a consequence to this. It may, to some people, seem like this is a scientific solution to some of the pragmatic problems that we face as a nation. Our president seems to have this interpretation. That because our birth rate fails to be equal or greater than the replacement rate, it is absolutely necessary that we reckon with the fact that there is coming a recession, just simply because you can't have an economy that requires this amount of people to continue at its size and productivity when you have a generation that is going to be less than that. There has to be some recession because of a lower population rate that is coming to our country. Well, science, modern wisdom has figured out that there is a way that we actually can create more human beings. In vitro fertilization is one such way. Now, we need to reckon with a few things, and that is one of the reasons that we have the practical problem of a lower birth rate is that men and women are not marrying as they once did. They aren't marrying at the same younger age. They're postponing children to later in life. And this is going to result in less children. So there's a spiritual reason that people are not marrying. There's a spiritual reason that people are not having children as they once did, and it has a practical problem. But now we have a moral, ethical dilemma with, well, so then can we just use conventional wisdom of our day to be able to do what God actually commanded Adam and Eve to do? That is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Well, one of the reasons that in vitro fertilization, I believe quite strongly, is off the table for Christians is because it kills human life. See, it'd be one thing if all of those conceived children through IVF were brought at least to have the opportunity to live. But that's not the way that industry works. See, modern conventional wisdom requires that it's just a numbers game, and many of those boys and girls, that life that is conceived there through this process, they will not come to have the opportunity in the womb of a woman to be born. They will be discarded. In fact, the way in which, and you can talk to some of our friends who were at this church like the Friedlands, the nature of the arrangements in IVF is such that you're not talking about life, you're talking about a material. In the same way that we could go to the store and we could buy something off the shelf, that kind of category, that's not human life, that's commodities. Or whatever warranties I may get at Best Buy for a TV, that's kind of the same category that IVF industries that they employ when they're talking about using their services which actually produce human life. It is commodified human life. It is absolutely materialistic, that all we are talking about here is not a soul, but rather we're just talking about material things that can be discarded like trash. This is the present day wisdom. I would call it the carnal wisdom of our age, which is somewhat similar to the carnal wisdom that would have been an accepted norm in the ancient Near Eastern practices that Sarah and Abram grew up in. Barrenness was indeed a great problem to women in Abram's day, just as it is to women in our day. But in fact, it had far more consequences and social scorn on a woman in Abram's day than it does tend to have in our day. And so when Sarah is faced with the situation that she, as we have been told from the beginning, is barren, that she is unable to have children, we see the material cause in verse 1 of chapter 16. There is another solution. She has a servant woman. This is to say, in one sense, she has an Egyptian who is her slave, and it is Hagar. See, the worldly wisdom, the carnal wisdom, that conventional way of figuring out how it is that you can get even what God may lawfully command you to pursue, but then ordain only his way. Sarah had another way. We may have IVF. Sarah had Hagar. And so she looks at her situation and she knows that it's absolutely critical that she have an heir, that she have a child that is credited to her and that would be seen by God to be Abraham's heir. And let's be honest, we are able to be told in verse 3, it's been 10 years. 10 years. Some of you know what it's like to go about 10 years wanting to have children. And month after month, you don't. My wife and I, we had 3, and then cancer put a kibosh to that one. And no, we had one. No, meaning we had 3 years of what it's like to know. We had one, and then we had 3, but we knew what it was like for 3 years. You desire, maybe this month will be different. And it's not. And your heart breaks, and your heart breaks, and your heart breaks, and your heart breaks. Some of you know 9 years. Sarah knew 10. What happens when God's promise is very clearly made, but yet God's provision of the promise is not according to your timeline? Well, you become impatient. That's what sinners are going to be tempted to do. The temptation is now, I am impatient with you, God. You have made a promise, and you are not delivering on your promise. Well, that's the wrong interpretation, but we're able to see that there's a competing scheme, there is worldly wisdom, there is a carnal way that Sarah realizes in her impatience and unbelief toward Yahweh that she can bring about fulfillment of the promise. Here's the spiritual connection between Sarah and her heart before God and her sinful utilization of Hagar. It was because she was impatient and unbelieving in God to be faithful to keep his promises that she committed the whole matrix of transgressions that emerge with what she does to Hagar. And so this is the first point. The carnal way does not fulfill God's promises. Our carnal ways, our worldly wisdom will not bring about the fulfillment to God's redemptive plan. See, we are geared to take things into our own hands, aren't we? And Sarah does exactly that, trying to bring about the fulfillment of God's promises, really the desire of her heart, when she is impatient and unbelieving that God actually, he doesn't see her, key word, and he doesn't care for her. So let's look at the carnal plan that Sarah cooks up. Here we are able to see that she is going to use this ancient form of surrogate motherhood by giving Hagar, her servant, to her husband Abram. In verse 2, we begin to see the plan. This is Sarah talking to Abram. Now, we should note, and there is incredible parallel in the Hebrew. I don't read Hebrew. I read those who read Hebrew. And so I have learned it from them. And what they tell us is if you were to look at what takes place in Genesis 3, and then you read in Hebrew verses 2 and 3, you're going to be like, wow, it may have been that Moses took the same way of writing Genesis 3 and he used it again to remind us. And so we're able to see that Sarah is talking to Abram. Now, is it bad for a wife to talk to her husband? No, not at all. But there can be a carnal way in which there is a reversal of God's creation order. And in Sarah's carnal plan, we're going to see that just like the serpent did to Eve in the garden, so Sarah here is inverting God's creation order, and she begins to concoct the plan. And Abram, like Adam, will listen to his wife. Now, this is in no way the Bible teaching, husbands, that God does not want you to listen to your wives. All right, that's not what this is teaching. However, we are seeing a pattern here, and the pattern is not accidental. The pattern is explicit by the way in which Moses renders this chapter in the same way that he rendered Genesis chapter 3, that this is a rejection of God's creation order that brings about the consequences, this big old mess. From unbelief and impatience in Hagar and passivity and a lack of love in Abram. So she says to Abram, now behold, Yahweh has shut my. She's probably not talking exactly like this, but I imagine there's some passion behind it. So Yahweh has shut my womb from bearing children. See, in Sarah's carnal plan, she has a carnal view of God. Now, it's half true, isn't it? Is God sovereign over absolutely everything, which includes wombs? Yes, he is. But the way in which she is interpreting the sovereignty of God over her womb, it is as if God does not see her, God does not care for her, and God has forgotten the promise that he has made that he will give to Abram a son. And so she says, Yahweh has shut my womb from bearing children. And now she has another plan. Please go into my servant woman. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. And here is the echo from Adam. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. See, she really has a carnal plan, and she is able to execute it because she has a carnal, that is to say, a fallen, fleshly, that is to say, fallen humanity's natural view of God. That is, God does not see me. God does not care about me. God is not going to fulfill his promises to me, and I need to do something about it. We're geared that way, aren't we? Now, I'll give just, we probably don't say exactly the same recipe that we have here, but here's some ones that I thought of. We literally could use IVF as one of the ways in which we do this as fallen men and women, that will kill life in order to get life. It's never right. As Jerry Miller says, it's never right to do wrong to do right. That's IVF. Literally surrogacy. I'll just use a distant illustration. Grace Community Church had I think it's Grace Community Church. No, actually it wasn't. It was the church that Adam Tyson, Tim Horner has classes. Lily, I think, has had some classes from Adam Tyson. I think he's pastor of Placerita Baptist in California. Well, they had a member in their church who was a nanny for, what's that? It's that rapper who made this sort of strange and temporary confession of Christ. But anyway, Kanye West. And so his wife actually didn't bear in her body their children. They employed a surrogate. And then they employed a nanny. So she didn't bear those children, she didn't birth those children, and she didn't raise those children. We have industries, don't we, that give us like, I want to be a mom and I'll pay you to actually carry my baby in your body and to birth her for me. And then I'll pay another person to actually raise my children for me. So that would be another. Here's another way that I think we can think, you know what, I'm going to just take matters into my own hands. We think, I mean, doesn't God want us to be happy? I mean, Jesus will frequently introduce in the Beatitudes, blessed is he. I mean, doesn't Psalms open with the blessed one, that blessed man? Now, we don't maybe go on to think about what it is that we are to be blessed, but clearly, doesn't God want to give blessings to us? And wouldn't God want us to be happy? Well, I know people growing up, the family that was our neighbors, very close with us, the husband. one day, this is my neighbors growing up, the husband eventually told his wife that he was not happy. And so he forsook his wife. My dad went and spoke to him and said, "You can't do this." And he said to my dad's name is Gary, "Gary, I believe God wants me happy." See, when we have a carnal way of thinking about our desires, even if they are something that God does have a lawful way for us, we should have children. There is a happiness that we can have and experience here. But when we have a carnal way of even thinking about those things, such that we will now go outside of God's way to get what we want, we are operating according to carnal wisdom. When we now are able to justify our sins to get what we want, we are operating like Sarah and according to a carnal plan. And so Sarah indeed is saying it's Yahweh who is keeping her from being pregnant. And she is impatient and unbelieving that God sees her and cares about her. So she is now taking matters into her own hands. And she presents to Abram Hagar. Now, it takes two to tango. And if you're going to try to conceive an heir through giving your husband your servant woman, your husband has to agree. I'm glad that we don't have to deal with this pastorally, but that was one of the things in the ancient Near East. And so what we find Abraham doing at the end of verse 2 is exactly what Adam did, which led to the fall of the human race and the curse of the world. He listened to the voice of his wife. That's what Genesis 3 says. Here it says, Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. Sarah is guilty for cooking up the plan. Abram is guilty for, he went along with the plan. She initiated, he followed. Did he have any care, any love, any faith in what God's plan was for his wife and his family and his seed? Seems that he too has morally failed because of a spiritual problem. And so, verse 3, we are reminded of how long it had been since they had been in Canaan. And Abram's wife, Sarah, took Hagar the Egyptian, the servant woman, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. It actually was a marriage. So now we have polygamy added to the matrix of transgressions. Here's one of the things that we're going to conclude from this passage. Carnal wisdom always seems to be a legitimate solution to our desires. It never is, and it always makes a big mess. This rejection of creation order because of the carnal way of Sarah and Abraham's thinking, their unbelief, their impatience with God's promise, has Sarah. She is initiating, she is the one conniving this carnal plan, and Abram, the man, he is passive and he is letting her do her sinful desires. He is not stepping in. He is not caring for her. He is not refusing so that they might believe God's promise. And so he does not lead, he does not correct, he does not point her to the character of God and the promises of God. And so together they make a giant mess. Unbelief and impatience with God will always make a big mess. Now, I know we don't want to say this, but we all can say amen, can't we? Every single one of us can say amen. Well, there's a backlash, as there always is. See, our carnal ways and wisdom seems like this is a good solution. But there is always a backlash. what happens is not what Sarah thought would happen. Look at verse 4. So Hagar is now his wife, and we read in verse 4, Abram goes into Hagar. She conceives. So, in one sense, like, hey, it worked. Well, look what follows. Then she saw. Does that also remind you? Two things connects with what we're going to see at the end in the servant of the Lord coming and visiting Hagar in the wilderness. And remember also the significance of the way Eve, what she saw first in the fruit and then what it ultimately yielded, were not quite the same. But keyword saw, that she conceived, and so her mistress became contemptible in her sight. Now, Malia and I have been talking about this passage through the week, and this has been a little bit who is contemptible in whose sight? Is it Sarah being contemptible in Hagar's sight? Is it Hagar being contemptible in her sight? And this is where you're able to jump down. Look at verse 5 at the end, and we're able to see this is Sarah talking to Abraham. So I became contemptible in her sight. So this is what it seems to be describing is once Hagar conceived, she now could look at her former master woman, Sarah, with contempt. See, I'm the one who bears the son. We just have to learn what is being taught here, and this will be on repeat. Our carnal ways, even when they yield what we want, will always be a giant backlash. You may want him, her, it, and then when you get him, her, it, money, like fill it in, it will not actually yield what you thought it would. You and I will always have a backlash when we, with impatience and unbelief, relate to God and take matters into our own hands, employing carnal ways to bring about what we think is the fulfillment to God's promise. That's exactly what is taking place here in this contempt that now Hagar has for Sarah. And so what happens? Like all backlashes, y'all fish? Right? If you throw a bait casting rod and reel, you sling that thing really hard, and then it catches a tree limb, and then it's like an explosion of fishing line all in your reel. That's what Sarah has done, and Abram. And so now Sarah, verse 5, she comes to Abram and she unloads on him. May the violence done to me be upon you. I gave you my servant woman into your embrace, but she saw that she had conceived. So I became contemptible in her sight. May Yahweh judge between you and me. Now we can just imagine, because maybe, just maybe, you've had some kind of similar situation, parallel situation, where the husband now he's responsible for everything, as if the wife had nothing to contribute to the scenario. And he's sitting there going like, what? Now, Abram's not off the hook. Abram is absolutely culpable for everything that Abram has done and failed to have done. But at the same time, Sarah is in no way operating in reality land. This is also what carnal ways and wisdom does. It's as if she fails to remember this was her plan. And yet, not only does she judge God, she now judges Abram. He is indeed worthy of judgment for what he has done, but Sarah is worthy of judgment for what she has done. And so she calls Yahweh to judge between them. Abram, continuing in the mess, the backlash only gets worse. Abram responds how? Behold, your servant woman is in your hand. Do to her what is good in your sight. Now, what is going to be good in the sight of this jealous, envious, angry, impatient woman? Sin. That's what's going to be good in her sight. What always precedes anger and wrath? Frustrated desire. Frustrated desire. You read James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Why are there fights and quarrels among you? Is it not this? You want and you do not have. That's why you fight and you quarrel. That's James. So Abram, absolutely being passive and shirking his duty, now selfishly gives right or encouragement to Sarah. She can do whatever she wants with Hagar. Hagar is now his wife. A complicated backlash as it is, he now gives his second wife, reason number 321, you only are to have one wife. But he now gives his second wife to Sarah for her to be wrathful, indicating that he now has rejected Hagar. She will remain the servant. And what does she do? Sarah afflicts her. Now, interesting, that little word there, afflict. Yahweh has already promised to Abraham what will his descendants receive from another country in another land. Affliction. That is the prophecy of Israel going into slavery under Egypt, and Pharaoh will afflict them. Same Hebrew word. What did Sarah do to Hagar? The same thing that Sarah's descendants will have done to them by Pharaoh. Afflict her. And so what does Hagar do? She fled from her presence. Now this is where we are able to see, this is the fruit. This is the fruit of our carnal wisdom being our carnal way to somehow think we can bring about the fulfillment of God's promises instead of patiently waiting and believing God to be faithful. And here's the irony, and this is where to be very fast. The foil, the positive, in one sense, instructive example is the Egyptian slave woman, isolated and alone in the wilderness, who is now visited by the servant of the Lord. There's a lot that we could go, and there's some wonderful lessons, but notice the key words. She flees, and who finds? The Lord. The Lord finds her. The Lord finds her because he sent his servant, this angel. Maybe it's the pre-incarnate Son of God. Maybe not. Maybe it's just an angel. Either way, she has fled. She is alone. She is in the wilderness. She is with child. She is rejected. She has been afflicted, and yet it is the Lord, through his servant, who finds her. And the Lord draws near to her. How does the Lord draw near to her? Through sending of his servant, and it's by his word. The servant speaks to her. The servant inquires of why is she there? And then the servant, or the angel of the Lord, he commands her what to do: return and to humble herself under Sarah. But then he gives a promise in verse 10 that her seed is going to be multiplied, so that they, in one sense, will be like a competition with the coming seed of Abraham. And her child is a son. The angel of the Lord tells him, name him Ishmael. And he is going to be a donkey of the man, meaning he's going to be difficult to get along with, but he also is going to get his way. And from him is going to come all these people, and he is going to be great. So the backlash continues, but God's compassion shows up. And unlike Sarah, how does Hagar respond? She actually believes. She believes that the angel of Yahweh, what he has said, and the character of God that he manifests, she believes this to be true. And so she responds with faith in verse 13. She called the name of Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel. She called the name of Yahweh who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees. Have I even remained here alive hereafter seeing him?" Therefore, the well was called, and there's a challenging Hebrew word here, but it seems to indicate the living God who sees. We're told where it is. Now, why is that included? Did Moses write the book of Genesis in the Torah? Did he write it so that exiled Egyptian slave women afflicted by their mistresses would be encouraged? No. He did it so that Israel and the church would continue to read over and over again the testimony of Hagar, being comforted by God and believing his word, so that we are the ones who know. Why did she name that well, that really hard to pronounce Hebrew word, which means the living God who sees? So as to teach all of us. It is the faithful character of God that brings about the fulfillment of his promises. It is not the carnal ways of his people. And then we get to see she obeyed the angel of the Lord, because in verse 15 we are told Hagar did bear to Abram a son. And what did Abram name this son of Hagar? Exactly the name that the angel of the Lord told Hagar in the wilderness to name him. Thus, Hagar goes back. Hagar tells Abram what the angel of the Lord told her to name this son, and Abram complies. Abram, who has the authority to name his children, names this son born of Hagar Ishmael. And what do you think Ishmael means? God sees. This was when Abram was 86, when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. See, there is an ongoing, can you imagine how many times in the house, backlash as it now is, in the household of Abram, do you hear this boy being called? Ishmael, come here, Ishmael. Ishmael. This lesson of God seeing and God in his compassion, acting to fulfill his promises, is not a lesson that we get from Sarah. It's a lesson that we get from the son of Hagar. God sees. Christian, you need to understand whatever your circumstances are, whatever you might be tempted to be impatient and unbelieving in relationship to God and his promises to you in Jesus Christ are. Be warned from Sarah and Abram's carnal way. It does not deliver as it seems. It will be a backlash. It will be a giant backlash beyond your ability. To this day, the descendants of Ishmael are a wild donkey in the sight of God's people. But God sees you. God hears you. Remember, Sarah's son, Ishmael, is a lesson to remind us. Sorry for going long. Come and talk to me with questions. Jesse will close us in a song and benediction.
Lord works through the details, even when we aren't tracking on them. I was hoping we would get back to Genesis today, but I wasn't totally confident. And yet our closing hymn this morning is By Faith, which seems very fitting for this passage. So if you would please stand, join with me as we sing. If you want to turn in your hymnals, it's 361. It's on the screen as well. By Faith, let's join and sing together. By faith we see the hand of God in the light of creation's grand design. In the lives of those his faithful men walk by faith and not by sight. We will stand as children of the promise. We will fix our eyes on him, our soul reward. The race is finished and the work is done. We'll walk by faith and not by sight. By faith our fathers roamed the earth. But the power of his promise in their heart. Of a holy city built like God's throne. A place where decent justice reigns. We will stand as children of the promise. We will fix our eyes on him, our soul. We will till the race is finished and the work is done. We'll walk by faith and not by sight. By faith the prophets saw a day when the cause for Messiah would appear. With the power to change of sin and death, and rise triumphant from the grave. We will stand as children of the promise. We will fix our eyes on him, our soul. He will till the race is finished and the work is done. We'll walk by faith and not by sight. By faith the church was called to go. The power of the Spirit to the lost. To deliver captives and to preach good in every corner of the earth. We will stand as children of the promise. We will fix our eyes on him, our soul. We will till the race is finished and the work is done. We'll walk by faith and not by sight. By faith this mountain shall be moved. And the power of the gospel shall prevail. For we know in Christ all things are possible. For all who call upon him. And we will stand as children of the promise. And we will fix our eyes on him, our soul reward. Till the race is finished and the work is done. We'll walk by faith and not by sight. Normally, right now, I would pray for our food since we're not eating together. I was doing the Bible reading challenge yesterday. Part of that reading was Psalm 67, which I thought was perfect for a benediction tonight or today. Psalm 67 to the choir master with stringed instruments, a psalm, a song. May God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face to shine upon us. Selah. Why?
that your way may be known on the earth, your saving power among all nations. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you judge the peoples with equity and guide the nations upon the earth. Selah. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. The earth has yielded its increase, God. God, our God, shall bless us. God shall bless us. Let all the ends of the earth fear you. You are blessed. Be healthy.
Good day.